And we are live now. So, hello everyone. Good morning, evening, afternoon, or good night to everyone around the world who is right now watching our webinar. I'm really glad to see you with us on our third webinar dedicated to Exchanges Week 2019. And the topic of our webinar today is ethics within exchanges. Why and how? So, these are the questions that we are going to answer during the webinar, and we hope that you will enjoy it. Can we next go to the next slide, please, Georgia? So today with us, we have our special guest, Professor De Souza, who is the Director of Education for the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics. And Professor De Souza is connecting with us from Melbourne. He's in Australia now. Good afternoon, I guess, right, Professor?
It's night. It's
Oh, it's
night.
night already. I'm very, very sorry. I didn't check the time zones.
It's,
But okay, thank you for joining us. And we also have Georgia Solda, the Scopy External Development Assistant of IFMSA. Hi, Georgia.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Hello.
Okay, Georgia is in Italy, and I'm Tanya. I'm the Scopy Director, and I'm located in Russia. So you can see that we're covering pretty much half of the globe right now, and we're going to present information to you, which will be dedicated to ethics within exchanges. So during the webinar, you will see that we will be asking questions that Professor De Souza will be answering for us with his experience and with his knowledge. And we hope that we will get some very useful and interesting information. And I just want to emphasize that you will also be able to ask questions to Professor De Souza. So if you're watching us on YouTube, you can find the chat either on your right of the screen or below the screen, and please feel free to ask questions. We will be glad to answer them either during the webinar or maybe closer to the end. And so right now we are moving to our first questions, and we have decided to start with this. So Professor De Souza, our first question to you will be, what are the set of values every medical student should take into consideration while going for exchanges?
Well, first and foremost, we have to understand what do we mean by values. You see, usually values are the rules by which we make decisions about what's right and wrong, or what we should or shouldn't do, good or bad, and they also at times tell us which are more or less important and which is useful when we have to take off with meetings, or when you look at one value over another value. And so when we talk about a medical student going on the exchange, our values as doctors, as carers, usually set on care, compassion, empathy, and respect. Respect for dignity. These are the set of values that globally a medical from the medical fraternity, whether you're a medical student and doctor, these are generally the values that go with you. Then there may be other values that sometimes from a cultural point might be important in certain areas, that help us in, if we have to choose between two values, which is more important, and so forth. But as a medical student, I would think that we all are, our profession of caring brings us together on these very important values, which sets the basis for. And when we talk about compassion, empathy, care, respect, dignity, and so forth, we look at all these are encompassed when we take into either the oath of the Hippocrates, or other the WMA and so forth, but they all fundamentally stem from these values. And so as a medical student going to another country or going to another region, I think these are the fundamental values that we'll have to show. And if you expand on these, you'll see that it covers yeah, even cultural issues. So if you respect, if you have, if your value shows respect, dignity for human beings, and so forth, it covers much of this area.
Okay.
Um, I think that sort of will give the fundamental, and we might then take it further and look at the values in where a regional effect might have. There may be other values that a culture might, and that I think is something that we will talk as we go in preparing when you go to another region, how we would be. It'll be important to know values, models, and so forth that can be marginally or mildly different in different regions, and the importance of being aware of that, so that when you go there, you don't transgress on any of the cultural issues around values, ethics, and morality, which we call cultural competency. And that's an important part of when we talk about exchange.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very interesting because exactly our next question would be, how do we consider ethics, morality, and religion? Because sometimes, exchange students might face difficult situations when they are in different cultural background, cultural setting. And do we need to somehow differentiate them from each other during the exchange? How do we just not forget about all of them, and how do we keep them in mind? Maybe you can elaborate on these a little bit more.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting and very important question that you have wisely put together here, particularly in the context of exchange. See, models have a greater social element to values and tend to have a very broad acceptance. So, models are far more about good and bad than other values. So, we thus judge others more strongly when we talk about when we took a or when we talk of models, we strongly on models than on values. So we that's what we tend to do. A person can be described as immoral, yet there's no word for them not following values. Do you see what I mean? So
Yes, yes.
sometimes we see this a couple of ways of defining or trying to define model as motivation based on what the ideas of right and wrong are. And of course, when we come to ethics, it's about right and wrong. And you can have, and we as doctors have professional ethics, but you seldom hear about professional models. Have you heard? We all know that we have professional ethics, medical ethics, professional ethics, but we hardly hear about professional models. So generally, ethics tend to be codified into a formal system or a set of rules which are explicitly adopted generally by a group of people. And in our case, it is what comes out as doctors, as from the medical and WMA and so forth put out some rules and ethical rules. And ethics are thus internally defined and adopted, whilst morals, if you consider, tend to be externally imposed on other people. This is the moral. So if you accuse someone of being unethical, it's it is equivalent of calling them unprofessional and may well be taken as an insult, and in fact can be sometimes perceived more personally than if you told them, look, you're immoral. So saying you're professionally unethical has a greater so in other words, what I'm trying to show you is the difference between ethics and morals, where morality comes. And in theory, and of course, we can um, consider ethics as knowing what's right and wrong. And morality is more to do morals around applying these right and wrong to get and showing respect, right? So that now when we come to religion, this is an important, very important area, because particularly for the medical students who are going on the exchanges, because one must remember much of religion is, when we talk, what first and foremost, what is the difference between spiritual and religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
One can be spiritual, is much more an innate. That means it's something inside, it's subjective. But when we talk of religion, it's a lot more where you are acting, taking part in a group, in a set of practices and behaviors. But very important to remember, why this is important is it depends on one important area is that each of us have our own beliefs, religious or not religious beliefs, whether it be agnostic or atheistic, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have this, and depending on where you come from. For example, if you came from a developed world, much of the Western world, one would consider, for example, I'll give you an example. I live in Australia. I've been here. I'm an Australian, and religion will might not be so important um, to many of us, or many of the students, doctors, as when you go to, say, the East. And I travel because my work takes me all over. And what we see then is religious practices taking place even within the medical system. I go for meetings, and they have a prayer or some type of ritual before they start. Now that's something that we don't normally do much in this part of the world. But when you are a exchange student, we must be cognitively aware of this difference, and so whatever we believe should not be necessarily exploited or shown or discussed or talked about, because it can be quite disrespectful. And again, if that will come back to values and morals, and the reason for us to respect other human beings and how they go. But the importance here is, I just explained, right, ethics and morality. And when religion comes, it comes from a belief. It's a group. It's governed by a set of rules and practices and so forth. And so they are quite distinctly different. But the important part to differentiate, why do you do need to differentiate this, because the values are pretty much global, and you might only have a cultural component but tell you which value is more important than another. But when it comes to religion, I think all of us, students and doctors, we need to show respect, be aware that your religious belief or non-belief might be different, might be very different from what the regions you're going to, and so you need to respect that and be aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
Is
So
that reasonable?
yeah, I think so. Just want to clarify, Professor, is it like, do I understand you correctly? So when it comes to religion, it goes even above maybe general ethics and morality. So we need to prioritize this when we're talking to the patient, their religion, the patient.
Yes,
Okay.
that is the fundamental
Mm-hmm.
place that you show respect
Mm-hmm.
and
Okay.
dignity, because for many people, their religion will define who they are,
Mm-hmm.
who they believe they are, and so when we disrespect that, we actually disrespect the very being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You
Oh,
see,
yeah.
so and unconsciously we might, but particularly I know I've had examples. If you come from a culture where religion is not necessarily respected or given value or given importance,
Mm-hmm.
without you knowing, unless you are very make an effort to be cognizant and remember that it might not be the same in other regions, then you might sometimes, without knowing, or trample or give little importance to something that for that patient and for the people there might be the core of their very existence.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I understand. Okay,
Yes.
thank you very much, Professor. It's really very interesting and important to keep this in mind. But now, if we get back maybe a little bit to medical ethics and medical values development, we want to actually ask you who, like, according to your knowledge, decides on medical ethics. Like you said, the medical ethics is the set of rules usually, and how do the medical values develop? Maybe you can give us a little bit of a background on this.
Yes, as you know, medical ethics and medical values um, have developed right over time. And you can go back to Hippocrates' time. If you take modern medicine, if you
Mhm,
go back, I am from covering the Asia Pacific region, and if you go back to the in India, there's a whole. In fact, I think the earliest set of ethics have been in these two. China, I think they had the Emperor's Yellow Book and Confucius and so forth. But I was reading that 3000 BC in some of the medical or their medical called Siddha, and another one called, later came Ayurveda, which is I think about 2000. They had a set of code of ethics already written, and very interesting. That's the history. And then comes, later than that came the Greek, the what is it, the Hippocrates. Before that there was also the what's the one from Babylon, that region, the um, Hammurabi Code. So these were how it developed. Have you heard of the Hammurabi Code?
I
Yeah, of
think
course.
so. Yeah, but if you can give us maybe a little bit of an
Well,
overview for those who are
this
watching.
is the history of how this developed. And if you look back,
Hmm.
the earliest is supposed to have been around 3000 BC. There is a medical, a type of, or a system of medicine called Siddha in the south of India, where the first texts on code of ethics as, for that practice, for those physicians, had been set out. Then somewhere around 1000 BC, if I'm around that period of time, there was another set called the Charak Samudra, which is the physician's code of ethics brought for uh, uh, another form of medicine called Ayurveda. Again, giving very specific do's and don'ts. You know, you cannot, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you should always respect the patient. You shouldn't have sexual relation. All this was there in 1000 BC. Then after that came the Hammurabi Code, which was the one in the Babylon in that region. That was the next known code of ethics. And then, of course, we came on to the Hippocrates oath, and you can see how it goes on. And in spite of all these oaths, in spite of all these ethics or code of ethics, again we see the flooring of these ethical issues in the Nazi experiments and so forth. And then came the Nuremberg code that came after the trials and so forth. And then we flowed on from that to the Helsinki Declaration by the World Medical Association, which has been changed or it has been updated. I think the last was in 2013. So these codes, values and so forth have been coming down the track and all come back to how we treat. And it's used for not only for your care and practice, but also for research and so forth. So that's the way it is. And currently, right now, we would say that medical ethics, that's the way it was developed. The WMA has put it. But then again, every country has a regulator will use this and can add and bring out a code of ethics. Now, in Australia, the Australian Medical Council has got a code of ethics. And if you go to other countries, you'll have the same. So the regulatory authority brings out, again, their code of ethics derived from this long history or the long journey that these ethics or in practice of medicine have taken place. And of course, even your medical regulator will have the code of ethics, but usually those ethics will not. It will incorporate the ethics that's given from the WMA or the revised Helsinki Declaration. It will cover that, and maybe there will be a few other areas that are important from a cultural, regional aspect too.
Hmm. Okay, thank you very much
So
for that.
that's important also for you to be aware for when you're going to when you're on the exchange, because what happens is you generally are aware of the broad Helsinki. All of you would be aware of the Helsinki Declaration and the ethics and the code of ethics and so forth. Now, when you go to another country or another region, you might have you need to be aware of what is their code of ethics. What does their regulator? How does their regulator? What code of ethics that your the other regulator, the country regulator has brought in? And I want here. Let me come back and give all of you an important message here. There is what is called the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights.
Hmm.
Have you heard of it? Have
Yes,
everyone heard of that?
I'm not sure if everyone, but like I personally
What
heard
do you
about
know
that.
about it? Tanya and Georgia, this is important for all of you. Why is it important? The on the 19th of October 2005, after a lot of due processes, exchanges, and so forth, at the UNESCO's 33rd General Assembly, this 15 principles called the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights was adopted. Now, why is it important? It was adopted by 198 countries, effectively the world. And why was that important? Because nearly 200 countries came together to agree on these 15 principles, right? And these 15 principles are declared on bioethics and human rights. And you'll see, yeah, I'd ask all of you, you can go on the web, to the UNESCO Chair's web, and you can have a quick look at all these, the Universal Declaration on bioethics and human rights. This will give you a good understanding where the world came together and the governments of these 200 countries, or 196 countries, agreed on these principles, on these values. And these include environment, biosafety, and cultural diversity, stigma, non-stigma, uh, discrimination. All these are values which you should know, because it I think will be very useful, not just for your exchange but in general, remembering that these were adopted by the world. There are very often it's very difficult for all governments, all countries coming from different systems to agree on any one area or one principle. But over time, this was agreed by 198 countries, so it is very significant and important. And besides the conventional autonomy, the issues around autonomy, justice, harm and benefit, it expands to include human dignity, human rights, equity, equality, stigma, cultural diversity, pluralism, gender disparity, protecting the future generations, and so forth, and also social accountability. I know that IFMSA has had social accountability as one of your areas, and it comes into this declaration.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Professor, thank you. We will definitely put the link to that document that you're mentioning in the description of the video afterwards, so that
Yeah.
students could refer to it. Thanks a lot. And
Yes.
I think we're ready to move on, right, with our
Yes.
questions? Okay, great. Then my next question would be, what are the main risks of a medical student doing an internship in a faraway country with a totally different cultural setting? What could you mention to us, Professor?
Yeah, that's another important area. And I think what we've just been discussing
Mm-hmm.
leads us on to this very important area, and that is respect, dignity, and being cognizant that values differ, more cultural values might differ, and there's an importance of showing respect, first being aware of it, getting to know about it, talking to your mentor so that you have a good understanding of what is expected, then showing that respect. Another important area is the type of attire, dress that you come from. One goes from one part of the world to another part. We must be aware that dressing is also an important part of a doctor, a medical student, and how each culture believes or expects of the dressing. So I think these are very important areas, because you are judged, and anything that shows disrespect, shows lack, even though you might not have be disrespectful, out of sheer sheer lack of knowledge, you might come out to be disrespectful, or in fact in some cases could be considered not keeping with their morals and values. So I think it's important for all, not only medical students but even For a doctor who's going for a placement, going to do a job or going to do work in different regions, must have spent some time acquiring the social aspects, cultural aspects, expectations, behaviors, and appropriate dress codes, because they might have different codes for doctors. What are they expected? So I think these are very important areas. Knowing the law of that country is very important. Knowing the ethical code of the regulator of that country, because when you go, you need to know that while we have a universal principles and we have a new universal ethics, medical ethics, we also find that some of the regions and countries might have other added codes or ethical issues that we might not consider so important in one region. And so we must be fully aware of that and the other one is the law, because law supersedes ethics. You must remember that. The law of the land supersedes
Mm-hmm.
any ethics, whether it's medical ethics, whatever it is, the law of the land supersedes. And that's the reason why, all the transgressions that took place in the Nazi time was they were following the law and did unethical things.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to be aware of that when you go law, code of ethics, cultural values, cultural beliefs, cultural attire or practices, these must be there. And usually your mentor will be a good place to start to get a good understanding of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because thank you. You actually get to the point that I was going to ask about. I mean, I don't actually honestly know on my own how frequent this situation may be faced. But what if medical ethics and the law differs in the hosting country? I mean, you already gave the example that there
Yes,
could be the cases and
the
lower is the above. But like,
well,
how should the student act in this case? Maybe you could give some recommendations.
yeah,
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I think we lost Professor De Souza. Something happened with the connection. Okay. Georgia, could you probably check?
Yes.
We're apologizing for the technical issues. Something happened with the connection from
Yeah. Let's hope we can
Professor's
reconnect
side.
soon.
Mm-hmm.
I think he touched many interesting points we don't really have often the chance to discuss. So it's really interesting to have a chance to listen to him right now and also go into these details. And it's for sure a source of inspiration for next discussions we might have in the future.
Definitely, yes, because besides we're really mentioning some new interesting documents for us to discover and discuss for the future.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Not able to connect with him or speak with him, so I'm not sure if he had major problems or he will be able to reconnect.
Let's wait for a minute or two.
Yes, for sure.
In the meantime, maybe you have questions to us. I know that. Okay, I just see the questions. Let me read them.
hello.
Yes, yes,
Hello.
Sorry about
yeah,
that.
something
Good,
happened.
you're back.
We were
Yes, I'm
really
sorry
worried.
about that. Yeah, that's a very good question. See, the first important thing is whatever our ethics whatever what the law of that country supersedes. And so the important issue will be every student going on the exchange should be aware of the law, particularly the law that relates to your practice or to the care and in the medical area. So you must be aware of it. Another area would be your mentor, because the laws will differ. I know when I go from Australia to the other countries, I become aware of the differences and the legal differences, uh, and that when you're in that country, that becomes what you should be respecting and upholding and making sure that you follow that law. So what I'm now talking to you is how do you prepare is to get as much information. If required, you go in and check the medical council or wherever they will have the laws and rules. But importantly, I think your mentor will be able to give you this, and I think it should be in your toolkit for all exchange students in their toolkit. Besides having the cultural competencies required for that region, you must also be have a good get a good understanding of the laws of the country or the region that you are going to have this exchange and you're going to be there, because when you're in that land or that country, those laws will hold good and you have to follow that and not let yourself in any way infringe those laws. So the best way to prepare for that is to be first aware that laws differ. Laws in countries supersedes the medical ethics or, for that matter, morals and values. So the law has to be, you have to be aware of the law. And so you need to get a copy, go through that, and make sure every time you do you come up with having to do something or make a decision, you also check is that decision is that decision not just ethical, but before being ethical, it should be within the law of that country. Then comes the ethics and values and all those areas. So that's important.
Okay, thank you,
Okay.
Professor. In the meantime, we got actually two questions from our viewers, and I'm thinking maybe it's more relevant to ask them now until we get too far away from the topic. So if you let me, I will read them.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. So one question is coming from Africa, if I'm not mistaken, exactly from Ghana. The person is asking, does specific practices of a certain country really affect standard ethics? And are you to compromise on standard ethics and follow the norm of the area you find yourself in practice? Basically, if it doesn't go along together with the the
Uh,
standard ethics, the norms.
yeah, I think here that's a very good question. Um, it's a very good question because you have got two issues. The ethics might differ,
Mm-hmm.
but before you took it the ethics, you must also consider the law, because you have to follow the law. But for example, if it's ethical in one country to do very unethical things, then I don't you while you might not in any way disrespect, you might not need to do something that you believe is unethical, but it doesn't mean that you have to disrespect, because if this is something that for example, I'll give you an example. If you take for example autonomy and consenting.
Mhm.
Okay, now in the developed world, where I'm in Australia, or for that matter I'm sure in many of the other countries, someone consenting is given. You give informed consent is a very important ethical requirement under the principle of autonomy. And but when you go to some other country or some other region, I, for example, see that the consent sometimes might not be so strongly followed as the way we follow it here in Australia. For example, you might a husband might you might talk to the husband. The husband might tell you, "Yes, go ahead with the operation,"
Mhm.
or "No, there's no need to ask. No, I don't. We need you needn't ask, discuss with my wife, right? I'm happy for her to be done." Now, that type of ethics might not be. You might not be used to it, but certainly in that culture, that type of taking decisions from a cultural perspective, although it doesn't fulfill the informed consent, the autonomy requirements, um, you you might not want to do it, but it might be culturally that's what happens there, and because ultimately the patient is the has to benefit, and if you didn't do that, they might not get, it might jeopardize the whole treatment. So those type of areas we must be aware, and you must be able to adapt to that. For example, I see this issue coming up. For example, the husband or the son might say, well, the family doesn't want the patient to know his or her diagnosis, right?
Mhm.
And they might have very good reasons for that.
Mhm.
And certainly in the place or the region that I work and practice in Australia, that under no conditions or no circumstances will that be accepted. But when I go to another country, in Asia, that seems to be quite often a request like that is taken and accepted and expected to be adhered to in that region. So you cannot you will do well to talk to your mentor, all, and you might have to respect. That's the way they take the consent, the decision, the making not telling the diagnosis, which is truth telling, a very important ethical issue, can sometimes be flawed. And so you have this delicate region to tread on, because particularly if you come from a culture that upholds this very strongly, this autonomy, the parts of autonomy. Another important area is privacy and confidentiality. It is it is a very important area in the developed world. We have a privacy commissioner. People could lose your registration, your job, but then you might go to your another region where it might not be law. It might not be even the practice. Someone might talk about the other patient, his diagnosis or her diagnosis in front of the other patients or front of people. So while you will be telling yourself, this is not ethical, this is not complying with the ethical requirement of privacy and confidentiality, it
Mhm.
And if this is what is happening in that new region, you have to just respect it and consider that's the cultural way of adapting to it. Because if you did go and tell them, look, what you're doing is unethical, I don't accept this. I can't follow. If you take that, then your whole purpose of your exchange becomes defeated. And I think part of the exchange, besides learning the not just medicine, but also the social aspects of medicine, the cultural aspects of medicine, and how the applications, that's the great advantage, besides and beyond seeing cases and seeing clinical material. It's also important for you to learn the social aspects of medicine, and from that comes ethical aspects. How does this all work? And that is a great learning opportunity for you. But again, this you need to keep aware. So I hope that has answered to some extent your question from someone in Ghana. Is that right? From Africa?
Yeah, correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor.
Yeah.
If something wasn't clear, feel free to ask clarification questions then. And we have another question, which comes from Tunisia. And I think it's more or less similar, but I'm still going to read it and then you decide how you want to answer it, okay? So it's all doctors slash medical students have the same ethics all over the world, more or less. Don't you think that religion and morality should be taken apart while practicing medicine? I would say that maybe it's a more philosophical question, but yeah, I think we want to.
I think definitely
Mhm.
the ethics part of it, again, it's more or less the same, but not necessarily always the same. But remember, morals have a greater social element to values and tend to have a very broad acceptance. So far, morals are far more about good and bad than other values. So what we do is we just judge others more strongly on morals than values. Okay,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
so certainly you should be aware of that, because ethical ethical codes are there, and more or less you're right. It is same. There may be slight variations on the ability of the each country or each region. But when it comes to religion, this is again an area that should be quite different, quite separate from your ethics but at the same time, religion, for it's not what you believe in, but it is the belief of your patient that you have to respect, irrespective of what you believe in, what religion whether you're an atheist or agnostic or whatever. The focus in health and as a doctor is your patient and the best outcome and well-being for your patient. And if their belief forms the basis for their very existence, then as part of your caring, and as you must take that into account in respect and giving it value and giving it a place in the treatment and care of that patient. Although you personally might not believe, might not need it for your care, your whole job is patient-centered care. And if that is important, that is the core requirement or belief of the patient, which then transcends onto that patient and the family's well-being, then you have an important responsibility to value that, respect that belief, and appropriately incorporate that into the care that you are planning or you're giving to your patient.
Okay.
Okay, I hope that
Yeah, yeah.
answered your question.
Hmm. Thank you very much, Professor. And I think we can move to the next part, which is the third part of our webinar, actually. And as you probably know, we don't only perform professional exchanges in IFMSA, but also research exchanges. So our last two questions will be maybe more dedicated to the medical research ethics. And yes, the first question would be, what do you think are the basic aspects of bioethics that should be taken into consideration when carrying out a research project?
I think the fundamental issue, the important area is the welfare, the well-being, and do no harm.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that should be the basis. So we have a number of reasons why we do a research, searching for a question, looking for that. But I think the fundamental aspect should be do no harm and the patient's well-being, and should be the fundamental and the utmost importance with what you're doing. You should be giving that importance.
Okay. Hmm.
And
And
from that step, and if you take that, then of course you have all the other aspects that when you're carrying out a research project, that's the fundamental, because all the rest is comes from that, informed consent, the three
mhm,
parts of informed consent, the access, which is coming under justice. All these are important areas, but the fundamental important one is the patient's well-being and do no harm.
I see, I see. I think you just mentioned about the three parts of an informed consent. Did I
Yeah,
hear it correctly?
the informed consent. The
Mhm,
person, the person should be informed. What does that mean? It means
mhm,
that you have given the information. The patient should have the patient or the subject should have the information. They must have the ability to, to understand cognitively. They should
mhm,
be have the ability to understand the information that's being given, to digest it, and they should be able to understand the implications of taking part or not taking part, right? So
mhm,
they
mhm,
it requires first language and all the type of words that are used should be easily understandable. The second part is that you must be cognitively intact, or what we call testamentary capacity. So she
mhm,
should have capacity to absorb and understand what is being said. And the third should be you should have the ability to know the consequences of the decision you're making, both
mhm,
if I took part in it and if I didn't take part in it, what will happen. So those three areas, and often you find we take informed consent. You give them, you just say, "Look, this is what it is," and then you tell sign on this page. But that is not the way it's done,
mhm, mhm. Okay, thank you.
right?
That's yes, that's very
But
important to be
there are
mentioned.
three important aspects to that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Great. And
all those come under. And I think you asked the next. I might go on to the next one, which is
yeah, yeah,
exactly
sure.
what we're talking of. How can you do without informed consent for the patients, participants, or subject? Now that is exactly what happened in the study in the Nazi, what was in the Auschwitz, and which became the fun, but the issue of the Nuremberg trials, where patients were never told what they were, what was being done. They were not given a choice, because informed consent means it's voluntary. They can choose. So they didn't
Mm-hmm.
have that. We didn't know why they were doing it. And even if we go back further down to the Tuskegee. Have you heard of the Tuskegee trial? That have all of you heard of that?
Yeah, we did about syphilis in Africa, right?
Yeah, the Tuskegee that was in United States. The government of public health did this, studying the course of syphilis
Mm-hmm.
without treatment. The patients were never told what the treatment was about, and even when antibiotic penicillin became available and they could have been cured, they did not allow them to do that. They didn't tell them about it, nor did they give them. And so these patients ended up in neurosyphilis or the tertiary form, and only in President Clinton's time did they apologize and for this. So that's so doing research without informed consent is totally first and foremost is unacceptable. It's unethical, and under the in any norm, it would be considered in some places even illegal,
Mm-hmm.
because there are some court cases going on about this, where I think a couple of years ago, the informed consent was so badly done that patients didn't know. And in fact, I remember in India, the Supreme Court put a stop to all research based on this, on poor informed consent. And that was the first time in the world, I think they brought out what's called an audio visual informed consent. So everyone giving informed consent had to be videoed, and yeah, so there was evidence that all those components were taking place. So there is, besides ethical, there is a legal requirement also for this. So you cannot, in the current, even with the Helsinki Declaration, we still have, from a legal perspective, also that informed consent, which highlights the voluntarism of the person taking part, being highlighted and being held, so the patient can, by saying that you get informed consent, that means you give the patient the option not to join in the research, and to know the consequences, and to be have so that they are able to make a valid. So if they didn't have an informed consent, it becomes pretty much illegal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. It was very important to mention those things as well. Yeah, since we face it frequently, and yeah, sometimes students are brought to the patients asking questions, and patients are not aware why they ask those questions. Or yeah, so we will keep this in mind while preparing the students. And I think we're finishing with this part and with our questions. Georgia, can you?
Tanya, I think again, I
Yep.
just spoke about this earlier to you. One of the
Mm-hmm.
interesting from the UNESCO Chair, from my as the Director of Education, we do have a webinar course, and we have now used it,
Mm-hmm.
as I was telling you, and I think all your students can be your IFMSA members. That this this collaboration of the IFMSA with the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics brings you this option or ability to actually to actually take part and join one of the certificate courses we have on the principles of bioethics and human rights, which I think will stand very good for, and it's actually the taught or the faculty that take this take you through the 15 principles, and they come from all over the world. So it's a very nice a good opportunity, that I think the members can come to IFMSA, and we can
Mm-hmm.
through Katrina and myself,
Yeah.
we've got one going on. It's going on now for some time. The second batch with Africa, with Mary Oboy from your IFMSA, organized this some time ago, and that's working well. Similarly with the other MSAI. So I would think that that's a great opportunity which will help you all in this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. Yeah, as I mentioned before, also to you, Professor Katarina, will get in touch with you, and maybe we'll think how we can actually spread this information to our members in
Yes,
order to, yes, to just bring this link. And I just wanted to also mention that there was the question that we put also in the PowerPoint, how we can prepare students for our exchanges and for the situation, the ethical situations during the exchanges. And we actually have the toolkit which we prepared by IFMSA in collaboration with the UNESCO Chair on Bioethics. And we're
yes.
going to once again share, like it's also always accessible to all the national exchange officers. They can find it, but we'll just put these links also below in the description of this video and send it once again to everyone to just use this information, because it's a very comprehensive PowerPoint with the explanation on how we should go through all the parts of ethics while explaining them to students. So I just wanted to emphasize this part as well. And yes, so let me just check if we have any questions now. Okay, we have some as well. Let me read them now. So, question: even if the participants consent, how can we, as doctors, administrate a treatment that can be harmful slash kill the patient? Is it essentially correct? This is exactly how the question is written. So I'll just write.
Well, the important thing is that every the information, every first and foremost, the research should have been approved through or what's called the ethics committee, or what's called the um, each place has got different names for it, but there is no ethics, no protocol, no study should be done without it being approved by a recognized it's called the Institutional Review Board is the official name, but it changes with everybody. It's usually called the ethics, the research ethics committee or whatever. Now that committee would be looking at the principles, and certainly if there was non-maleficence, or if it was going to be harmful, then they will not have approved it, right? So one needs to first make sure that it is any study should go through the ethics committee and be approved, and usually that approval requires an information sheet to have been approved by the patient. Information sheet should have been approved by the committee, which is required to make sure that all the components I spoke about, the information and so forth, is well correctly presented, and so certainly these are important areas. I hope that answered your question, because you were asking if you think it's going to harm the patient. Is that right? Should you do the research? Is that what the question was?
I think, well, how can we as doctors administrate a treatment that can be harmful? Is it ethically correct? I think it's, I mean,
Are you talking about a treatment, or are you talking about a research? What are we talking about?
I
A
think this part
treatment,
was
a
about a
treatment in
treatment.
research. Sorry?
Yes. I think it's like treatment in research.
That's right. So the treatment and research won't take place if the ethics committee found it to be harmful. They would not have passed it.
Mhm. Okay, and then we have this question from the same person. The following question: what is the limit between something ethically correct and something not in research? How to define that again?
Well, there is, for example, the Helsinki Declaration gives you the research. You have got the research requirements should fulfill the Helsinki Declaration. And in some countries, they might have a higher threshold. They might want more than the Helsinki Declaration. But certainly, that is the benchmark. The current declaration, which has been updated 4 or 5 times, It is, I think, 2013 or 15. There was the last update. So that gives you the threshold of what is required for the doing research. So one of the things you might like to do is to put a link to the current updated Helsinki Declaration, so
Yes,
that all your students on the exchange who would be looking at doing a little bit of research to come back and write a paper or so should be aware of that. So that might be another. One is the Universal Declaration, the other is the Helsinki Declaration.
Yes, I just already noted it for myself as well that we
Yes.
need to put this link to in the description. And I think that actually finishes our questions. We don't have any more. And
Good.
I think yes, I think at this point I just want to really, really thank you very much, Professor De Souza, with being with us today and performing this amazing webinar. And we really learned a lot, even us, like Georgia knew during
Yeah, thank you a lot.
communicating with you.
It was
Yes,
super interesting. And also thanks for dedicating the time to prepare the webinar in advance and getting in touch with us and proposing
Sure.
all these good projects. Yes.
Pleasure was mine. Welcome, and I wish you all the very best in your planning, in your exchange. For those of you who are going on exchanges, I wish you all the best and a great experience that you'll take back with you when you continue with the calling to care for patients through your skills as a doctor. All the very best to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. And
Thank you again.
Yeah, you wanted to say
Okay.
something, Georgia, or I just?
No.
Okay, good. Then I will also thank our viewers and listeners for the webinar, and feel free to rewatch this webinar whenever you feel like you need to, and also feel free to use the information shared today while preparing your students for going to exchange. It's very important to go through all the things that we went through today together. And once again, thank you, and see you at other webinars. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.